Greetings, my name is Shane Skaggs, and today I'm going to be talking about human influences on the structure of Central American food webs. A food web describes who eats who in an ecosystem. Here we have a nice illustrated example depicting the feeding relationships in a North American food web. Food webs like this one are often represented as network graphs, and this enables us to understand some important things about the species interactions that take place. First, they help us understand structural regularities across ecological communities. For example, we can describe how densely connected an ecological community is, and we can learn about the distribution of feeding links across species. A food web makes it possible to describe the continuum of diets from very specialized species, like a monarch butterfly, to very generalized species like hawks or coyotes. These structural regularities are critically important for applying ecological knowledge to deal with real environmental challenges in natural resource management. For example, things like invasive species and identifying and protecting rare specialist species. We can describe this continuum by calculating a measure of generality for each species and looking at how generality varies in the food web. Generality is similar to diet breadth. And in a food web context, you can think of generality as the position of a particular species on a generalist-specialist continuum. We can also consider how vulnerable a species is to predation by calculating how many predators target that particular species. Those species with very high levels of vulnerability serve as important foundation species for the feeding interactions in the overall community. Here I've provided a cartoon version of a food web. To illustrate this, we have a top predator, a raptor, an omnivorous primate, an herbivorous rabbit, and a fruiting plant. Ecologists are interested in explaining the distribution of generality and vulnerability in a food web, and it's been widely observed that predators tend to prey upon species which are smaller than them. This gives the predator a broader set of prey options. So if we compare the log body size of predators to the log body sizes of their prey, we can expect an increase in the generality as body size increases, very similar to the one shown in this figure from a paper led by Dominique. Networks can also help us understand both the direct and indirect effects of interactions, meaning that we can start to understand how changes to the diet of one species could have cascading impacts on other species to which that focal species is not directly connected. We can do this by studying paths. A path is any set of edges between two pairs of nodes in a network. Food webs can therefore be generally characterized by their average path length. A food web that has a shorter average path length is more densely connected. We can explore indirect effects with simple computational experiments where we remove a species from the network and then we compare the structure of the original network to the structure when that species is excluded. So returning now to our cartoon food web, let's imagine that we remove this hawk from the food web. We see that what remains is a simpler food web that just contains our omnivore, herbivore, and fruiting plant. But if we instead choose to remove the primate species, then we lose both the direct connections associated with that primate as well as the connection between the hawk consuming the primate. This makes the hawk entirely reliant on the rabbit for food. Now, I remember in primary school learning that humans are top of the food chain. And despite this conventional wisdom, humans are rarely ever included in food web graphs. And I think there are some problems with excluding humans. One is that excluding humans reinforces the Western Eurocentric perspective, which places humans, particularly white Europeans, outside the food web as passive observers of nature, much like the way I've depicted the food web here. This is a philosophy that is incompatible with the observed embeddedness of humans in ecosystems, and it should be discarded. Second, excluding humans limits our ability to describe specific ecological roles for human activities. That is, it is harder to see the specific benefits and impacts that humans can have on ecological communities. And this is becoming increasingly relevant as we think about fostering improved coexistence between species in our societies. There are some noteworthy exceptions, though. Jennifer Dunne and her colleagues reconstructed 2 Pacific marine food webs and found that humans were highly generalist, more so than would be expected for their body size. Similar results have been found in the western desert of Australia, where Stephanie Crabtree and her colleagues Rebecca and Doug Bird used ethnographic interviews to reconstruct the vertebrate food web for the western desert. And they found that humans far surpassed the generality of other species in that ecosystem. Generalists play important roles in ecological communities. By preying on a wide range of species, generalists reduce the population sizes of many of their prey, and this actually reduces competition for resources among those species. There's a very famous example of this from Yellowstone National Park, where the extirpation of wolves in the early 1900s led to an explosive growth of deer and elk who overbrowsed the vegetation and outcompeted other herbivores. When wolves were reintroduced in the late 1990s, there were dramatic changes to the biodiversity of the ecosystem. Generalists also serve as hubs for the overall food web network. Since many feeding links flow through generalists, their presence increases the overall connectivity of the food web, and this increased connectivity makes the food web more resilient to many kinds of disturbance. In this study, I want to test some of these ideas in the neotropics, and in particular, I want to describe the potential influence of humans in a neotropical food web and model the effects of body size on generality and vulnerability. I will also conduct some simple exclusion experiments to understand how the food web changes when humans are excluded. To begin to answer some of these questions, I worked with Kekchi Mayan folks who forage and farm in southern Belize. Much of the work I've done there with my advisor has focused on the effects of human disturbance and agriculture on forests. But here, I'm going to focus on the way that Kekchi Maya people are interacting with plant and animal species. The people in these communities practice a mixture of subsistence agriculture, market engagement, and hunting and foraging activities. A subset of this community goes hunting on a semi-regular basis, and many people gather a variety of important species from their forests. To begin reconstructing a food web, I conducted interviews with Kekchi Maya hunters and farmers in southern Belize. I did this after I had my methods reviewed by our institutional review board, and after I received permission and support from the local village leaders and the National Institute of Culture and History in Belize. Conversations revolved around understanding the species that people hunt and forage for, and then snowballed outward to include how these prey species interact with other species in the neotropical rainforests. From conversations like this one, it became clear that hunting successes relied heavily on having an understanding of the trophic interactions that take place in the forest. And this quote here makes this point quite nicely. I also drew upon a report created in 2004 called the Wealth Report. This document provides a detailed account of cultural practices and traditional ecological knowledge that is used in Kekchi communities. This report contains several useful appendices that catalog useful species and ecological knowledge. With the help of an undergraduate research assistant, we conducted a literature review of more than 150 wildlife ecology studies throughout Central America. This is a large and ongoing effort that I think really showcases what can be done with a secondary data set and a review methodology. Here's a graphical representation of the Central American food web that resulted from all of that work. The species here are laid out in concentric rings, and I focus the graph around humans who are positioned centrally. This graph provides a global overview of the food web, but its complexity makes it difficult to distinguish the patterns of interest. So we're going to turn instead to some descriptive analyses. Let's start by looking at the potential human influence in this food web. One way we can do this is by looking at the number of feeding paths that originate at a species and counting the number of other species that could be reached from that origin. On the right, I've done this for every species in the food web and plotted the distribution of the number of reachable nodes. We can see that humans are able to reach the most species with 688, followed closely by jaguars with 632 species. So more than 1/3 of all species in this food web lie somewhere on a path that originates at humans. To estimate generality and vulnerability, I'm using a Bayesian multi-level modeling framework. I'll spare some of the most technical details, but for any statistically inclined folks in the audience, this is the general model form. I'm estimating a latent generality effect G and a latent vulnerability effect V, along with varying intercepts for each pair of species. These latent effects allow me to include submodels shown at the bottom here, where I can estimate a body size parameter, beta M, on both the generality and the vulnerability for every species. Previous studies that I showed simply plotted the raw counts of the number of species that are consumed in order to understand the position of humans. So why am I going through the effort of building this complicated multi-level Bayesian model? Well, rather than assume that humans are exceptional, I'm going to treat them the same as any other animal in the data set and let the power of probability work out whether there is evidence for human generalism or not. Doing this will allow me not only to estimate the effects of body size, but it will also allow me to use partial pooling, a technique in multi-level modeling that pools information across varying intercepts. In this case, our species. This approach will give us greater confidence in the evidence for generality and vulnerability, if there is any, and it will provide us with a robust estimate of the uncertainty of these species interactions, something that was not included in the previous studies. For these preliminary results, I'm focusing just on the predator-prey network. So here I've removed all of the plant species, and I'm showing just the feeding relationships among all of the terrestrial wildlife. Each point in this graph is a species, and the size of each point represents the average body size of that species in grams. Now, the first thing we can do is compare the posterior estimates for generality and vulnerability. These estimates tell us for each species the average probability that a feeding link would be observed, regardless of the identity of the prey species. Species with high probabilities are likely to prey on any species. Likewise, those species with high probabilities for vulnerability are likely to be eaten by any other species. Although these are averages here, each point is an estimate that comes from a posterior distribution of probability estimates, which we can always use to dig deeper into the uncertainty of these trophic interactions. Note the negative association between these estimates. This suggests that generalist species tend to be less vulnerable on average. This also implies that the diets of more vulnerable species tend to be more specialized. Now, using these probabilities, we can generate predicted generality and vulnerability histograms similar to those that are reported in previous studies. We find here that although humans are indeed more general than most species, they are not expected to be the most general overall. And strictly compared to other predators, they are not expected to be a super predator. However, including plants in a future model would probably change this result. We also see that humans are expected to be somewhat vulnerable to predation, and this is due to the partial pooling of the effects of body size. When we look specifically at the body size parameters, we find that body size has a positive effect on both generality and vulnerability. That is, larger species tend to be more vulnerable to predation. This echoes conversations in conversation biology about large-bodied prey being the primary targets for human and non-human predators. We also find similar results for generality. As body size increases, we expect an increase in generality. Now here, I'm showing some results of the exclusion experiments. In this table, I'm showing that when humans are removed from the food web, we see very little change to its overall structure. This is quite different from previous studies of human-centered food webs, which saw a dramatic change in the structure when humans were removed. Now, thinking about these results, one thing is clear: humans are deeply connected to the neotropical food webs. And like some of the previous studies, humans are among the most general predators in the food web. But in this neotropical context, we find that there is a presence of multiple generalist predators, and this provides more redundancy to the food web structure. In the exclusion experiments, I found that removing humans did little to change the structure of the overall food web. This might seem a little bit unexpected, but this result suggests that the human role mimics that of other generalist predators also in the food web. It's a result that harkens back to arguments that were made by Clifford Geertz, who said that practices like Swidden agriculture are an attempt to mimic the disturbance patterns that are typical of tropical forests. And I believe the same could be said about the role of humans in this food web. Now, there are some limitations to this analysis, and I don't want to dwell on these too long and go over time. So I'll list them here, and we could come back to them in the Q&A later. But I do want to point out some of the next steps that I'll be taking. One, I want to include plant species into the model. And I also want to build in some predictors about human disturbance, because there's a question here about how species who are associated with human settlements and anthropogenic forests are positioned within the broader food web. Now, I want to say thank you to some of my collaborators and the folks I've worked with in southern Belize. I appreciate their time and the conversations that we've had together. There were major contributions to this data set that were made by undergraduate Andrew Shen, and I want to thank him very much for his efforts. And support for this research was provided by my advisor, Sean Downey, as well as the Sustainability Institute at Ohio State and the National Science Foundation. If you're interested in this work or you'd like to learn more about it, you can contact me here. I've provided my email and my Twitter handle and a link to a website I run where we work on learning about social ecological networks. So thank you very much for listening.